Something strange is unfolding in North America's auto industry. A move meant to strengthen America might actually do the opposite. A few weeks ago, Stellantis, the parent company of Jeep, announced plans to relocate production of the Jeep Compass from Brampton, Ontario to Belvidere, Illinois. On the surface, it looked like a petrol.
Stellantis is moving production from this assembly plant in Brampton, Ontario, across the border to Illinois.
And we're not just going to sit here and say that's okay, because it's not okay. They've made commitments to this plant.
The company closed the plant in 2023, temporarily laying off 3,000 workers.
Patriotic win for Washington and a setback for Canada. But the deeper the story goes, the more it looks like a case of overconfidence and miscalculation. The company's goal seemed simple: dodge Trump's new 25% import tariffs by manufacturing within the United States. The move fit into a $13 billion, four-year plan to expand domestic output and create 5,000 jobs. It was supposed to symbolize a Made in America revival. Yet, the markets weren't convinced. Within a day of the announcement, Stellantis shares dropped as analysts warned that high U.S. labor costs, rising energy prices, and strict Buy American compliance rules would wipe out any potential savings. Across the border, Canada's response was calm but calculated. Prime Minister Mark Carney and Ontario Premier Doug Ford didn't react with outrage. They projected control. Both reminded the public that Stellantis was still legally bound by previous employment and investment agreements. Meanwhile, Ottawa began quietly invoking
CTV News has obtained a letter by Jolie to the president of Stellantis today, stressing Stellantis agreed with the governments of Canada and Ontario to maintain its full Canadian footprint, including Brampton, in exchange for substantial financial support. Anything short of that commitment will be considered a default under our agreement.
We will make sure that we push the company and we hold them to account.
Legal clauses that would make a full withdrawal from Canada expensive and complex. The question now hovering over the entire episode: did Canada just lose an automaker, or did Stellantis walk into a trap of its own making? The real twist lies not in Brampton or Belvidere, but in Washington's own trade policies. When Trump's 25% import tariff package took effect on April 3rd, 2025, it reshaped the entire foundation of global car manufacturing.
Emotionally, it's very hard because there's a lot of uncertainty. I mean, we got 3,000 members in that Brampton assembly plant, 1,000 plus members that supply that plant and the parts supplier base.
Stellantis, which is known for brands like Jeep, Dodge, Chrysler, and Fiat, reporting that the U.S. president's auto tariffs have so far cost the company $480 million Canadian.
Suddenly, every cross-border supply chain Stellantis had spent years refining was thrown into disarray. European-built components, parts from Mexico and Canada, all of it became pricier, slower to move, and tangled in new red tape. By the end of the second quarter, the financial hit was severe. Stellantis had absorbed about $300 million in extra costs. Its first half net loss reached $2.3 billion, with analysts warning that total losses could exceed $7 billion by year's end if tariffs persisted. The fallout spread quickly. Factories in Michigan and Indiana faced temporary shutdowns, and 2 Jeep models imported from Mexico were halted altogether. Roughly 900 American workers were furloughed. Caught in a waiting game for clarity that never arrived, Trump framed the outcome as a win for his America First agenda, claiming it proved that U.S. manufacturing was bouncing back. But Stellantis' balance sheets told a different story, one where protectionist policies were costing more than they saved. The supposed revival was becoming a drag on the very companies it aimed to help. Meanwhile, Canada wasn't just sitting on the sidelines. Ottawa moved strategically, using contracts and law rather than politics. Foreign Minister Mélanie Joly publicly reminded Stellantis that the company was still legally bound to its 2022 EV investment commitments. Any cuts to Canadian jobs output could trigger penalties. Behind the scenes, officials explored options to classify the relocation as a contract breach, allowing Canada to demand compensation or redirect production work back to Brampton. Doug Ford stood firmly behind this approach, urging Ottawa to match Trump's toughness with firm, strategic action. Canada responded by activating safety provisions within the EV deal that compelled Stellantis to keep parts and component production on Canadian soil. That single move prevented a full exodus and showed how Ottawa's quieter, rule-based approach could outmaneuver political theatrics. While Brampton faced an uncertain future, another story began taking shape in Windsor. Instead of collapse, Canada was quietly reshaping its auto industry around the electric transition. To balance the loss of Jeep production, Stellantis added a third shift at its Windsor assembly plant, boosting output and safeguarding hundreds of jobs. The Ontario government expanded retraining programs, helping over 2,000 displaced Brampton workers transition to the Next Star EV battery project, a joint venture between Stellantis and LG Energy Solution worth nearly $5 billion Canadian dollars. Now entering full operation, the Next Star facility is projected to create 2,500 high-quality jobs and position Windsor as a cornerstone of North America's electric vehicle supply chain to in the end. What began as perceived defeat for Canada evolved into a calculated transformation. Washington's tariff gamble triggered short-term applause but long-term strain, while Ottawa turned a crisis into leverage. By focusing on law, contracts, and the future of EVs, Canada may have quietly secured more stability and more jobs than the U.S. did through loud declarations of victory. The question that started this story still lingers. Who truly won? On paper, production returned to American soil. But as costs soared, profits shrank, and Canada secured the next generation of EV investment, it's becoming clear that strength isn't always about shouting the loudest. Sometimes, it's about knowing when to stay silent and let the contracts do the talking. Within months of Stellantis' decision to move Jeep Compass production from Ontario to Illinois, the contrasting outcomes on each side of the border revealed two very different approaches to industrial strategy. In Canada, what began as a potential economic setback quickly evolved into a demonstration of resilience and foresight. Meanwhile, in the U.S., the move that was supposed to symbolize strength turned into an expensive experiment in protectionism in Canada. The Unifor Union worked to extend federal and provincial employment support through 2027, ensuring job stability for affected workers. By mid-year, Ontario had managed to turn disruption into momentum. What once looked like a corporate withdrawal became the foundation for a stronger, more flexible auto sector. Ottawa treated the Stellantis relocation not as a failure, but as a stress test of its evolving industrial model. By reinforcing commitments under the 2022 EV investment agreements, the Canadian government made it clear that global automakers couldn't simply pull out without consequence. The result was renewed confidence among investors. Over $1.2 billion Canadian dollars flowed into the Windsor-Essex region, supporting local suppliers and new EV component manufacturers at the same time. The Next Star Energy Project, a joint venture between Stellantis and LG Energy Solution, entered its operational phase, creating thousands of skilled jobs and positioning Windsor as a central hub in North America's electric vehicle supply chain. The combination of legal leverage, proactive retraining programs, and targeted reinvestment helped Ontario avoid the mass layoffs and economic uncertainty that often follow corporate relocations. By the third quarter of 2025, unemployment in the province held steady at 5.6%, while auto parts exports to the European Union jumped by 18%. Canada's reputation as a predictable, rules-based economy began to attract attention from global manufacturers seeking refuge from North America's growing trade volatility. Across the border, however, the picture was far less stable. For Stellantis, coming home to America turned out to be far more expensive than staying in Canada ever was. Labor costs in Illinois were 25 to 30% higher than in Ontario, and energy prices spiked nearly 40% after the rollback of federal fuel subsidies. New Buy American regulations forced Stellantis to rebuild its entire supply chain with domestically sourced components, creating bottlenecks, slowing deliveries, and strangling efficiency. U.S. plants were running at just over half their intended capacity, with unfinished vehicles piling up in factory lots. The financial toll was staggering. Restructuring costs, supply chain rebuilding, and compliance expenses added up to an additional $3.3 billion in net losses. Investors grew skeptical, arguing that Stellantis hadn't solved its tariff problem. It had merely traded a political crisis for a financial one. The intended savings from avoiding import taxes were erased by the high cost of producing under the new rules. For the U.S. auto sector, the policy that promised to bring jobs home ended up exposing how fragile domestic competitiveness had become in a globalized economy. In contrast, Canada's quiet, disciplined approach demonstrated the long-term power stability.